Thank you for the invitation. I'm really happy to join you today. I am going to be speaking about my research, and as I listened to the introduction about the mandate for Creative Mornings, I thought, well, you're going to see my passion today. You're going to see the things that matter to me, where I've spent 25 years of my life. Now, it's interesting. You can see by these book titles here, amongst other publications, I'm an expert in procrastination. But I've also been labeled a productivity expert, and they became very uneasy bedfellows. But some of you may know Brene Brown. She has an expertise and lectures a great deal on wholehearted living. And yet, did you know that her background academically is that she's a shame researcher? And like me, she feels an uneasy tension of how does a shame researcher become an expert in wholehearted living? Well, she writes in this book, The Gifts of Imperfection, a very profound line for me. And that is, we have to talk about the things that get in the way of doing what is best for us. And that really is the theme of my talk today. What gets in the way? And that's why I feel really comfortable about talking about not just procrastination, but what it has to say about successful goal pursuit as well. So what does get in the way? Well, you're going to hear me talk about some common misconceptions. I would argue that these, amongst other things, I have 30 minutes with you today, so I'm not going to tell you everything I know about procrastination. That's simply not possible. But working earlier with Marwan and Maxine, they picked out some of their favorite topics, knowing this community, and said, please address these things. And so I'm going to talk about, can procrastination be a good thing? What's this notion that it's a time management problem? What about it feeding creativity? Do I really work better under pressure? Does my work have to be perfect? I think it has to be. And if I have time, I'm going to talk about some of the consequences of procrastination that might surprise you. Now, I do want to make a note about my purpose, which is that when you leave today, I hope you're going to understand the theory and research behind procrastination. So you'll have a better understanding of what it is and what it isn't, as Maxine said. But more importantly, you're going to have some strategies that you'll be able to use 30 minutes from now if you want to. And honestly, I would tell you that this can be life-changing for you if you want it to be. Now, I'm going to go at quite a pace. I know that they had over 300 registrations. That's a very large audience from all over the world, in fact. And so I don't know what each one of you is ready for. So I'm going to speak quickly. I'm going to present lots of things, and what you're ready for is going to stick. There's no exam, so you don't have to catch it all. And in that regard, my slides can also be very busy. Some of you like to read, and you'll absorb that as you're listening. And as well, I'm here to tell you a likely story based on research, my own and my colleagues. So typically at the bottom of every slide, I'm going to show you a study or introduce you to a book on which I base this story. This is not just the world out of Tim's head and Tim's experience, but I would say this is the best story I can tell based on the research we have to date. And with that as an introduction, I'm going to begin with this first misconception that procrastination can be a good thing. It has the Latin roots of belonging to tomorrow, to postpone to another day. That doesn't seem so bad, does it? That it belongs to tomorrow. Unfortunately, you and I know what tomorrow is a mystical land where 98% of all human productivity, motivation, and achievement are stored. And I know when I'm at a live audience, everyone snickers or giggles at this point because we just know it's so true. I will do it tomorrow. I'll feel more like it tomorrow. So it's problematic in an important way. Now, as psychologists, we define procrastination very specifically. We say it's the voluntary delay of an intended action despite expecting to be worse off for the delay. There's a lot of important things in there. It's voluntary. I'm not being forced to delay. Unfortunately, for example, just a moment ago, our music was delayed. And I'm going to explain that in just a moment of how we might frame that. But it wasn't voluntary delay in some ways. And the key thing here is that we expect to be worse off for the delay. In fact, a colleague of mine from Utrecht, we have some European participants today. This is one of my best friends. He's a philosopher at Utrecht, and he has said it so succinctly, it's culpably unwarranted delay. That we know the delays in our lives for which we are responsible, and it's really unwarranted. In fact, some of you were sharing things today where you'd say, these are the things I'm procrastinating on, and these are the things I feel I'm culpable for. Now that has led me to say that, all procrastination is delay, but not all delay is procrastination. And this is very important for us to understand. At the end of a busy day, when I see that laundry basket still full of laundry and I haven't put it away, if I only have one word for delay and that's procrastination, I feel horrible about myself. But in fact, maybe I'm just very busy and it's not very high priority. So one of my past PhD students, Dr. Mohsen Hagman, he's finished, he did an amazing job in his PhD, one of the best I've ever seen. He defined a bunch of different kinds of delay. You know, if not all delay is procrastination, what other kinds are there? Well, we use our practical reason every day to set priorities. And so some things must wait while we do other things. So there's purposeful delay. And we right now have purposefully delayed the performance until later because we needed to solve a problem. But in some ways too, it was an inevitable delay. We've all joked that, well, we're virtual. You know, and right now I have 2 or 3 different possible internet systems I can join because inevitably something fails when we do these sorts of things. So that's another form of delay. When a plane doesn't arrive on time and you're late and you arrive and someone's been waiting for you, you don't say, sorry, I'm such a procrastinator. So that's not procrastination. Now I'm sitting in a room here and just to the left of me is a picture of my father. I lost my dad in 2016, and when he died, my life came apart in some ways because I loved him very much. I still do. And I delayed lots of things, but not for a moment did I say, oh, Tim, you're such a procrastinator. And we would call this delay due to emotional problems. In fact, many of you may be experiencing delay during this pandemic. And I have journalists ask me all the time, Tim, do you see procrastination increasing with the pandemic? And I'd say, I see more delay, but I think some of it is due to emotional problems because the pandemic is taking many of us apart at the seams. Now, there are other kinds of delay that Mohsen identified, irrational, hedonistic, and arousal, and these have the flavor of procrastination because we know we're going to be worse off for the delay. So this is really important to distinguish these. And in fact, I have a doctoral student right now, Shamaruk Chowdhury. She'll be finished very soon. And she and I took an interest in something called active procrastination. And of course, we see this as an oxymoron. You know other kinds of oxymorons, the genuine imitation being one of many. And of course, what active procrastination really is purposeful delay. So we argue you don't modify the word procrastination. You have to become more nuanced in your understanding of delay. So the first strategy I'd offer for you today is you want to be able to name that which is procrastination, because to name it can be to tame it. We have to see procrastination for what it is. We know that we use our practical reason and we delay things every day. You have to start to label these delays. Some of you may have written down things on that list in the chat group, and already you're thinking, yeah, maybe that's not procrastination. You have to keep it clear that there's a self-defeating nature to procrastination. Perhaps Julie's delay on getting those garden boxes ready has everything to do with, you know, the weather hasn't been really conducive to being outside, and she truly does have more time. She's not going to be worse off for this delay. But we can't turn a vice into a virtue, and this is where some wisdom comes in. But then, what about procrastination and creativity? I know amongst this group that creativity is a big focus. And of course, someone who's taken this on best is Adam Grant, who in January of 2016 wrote a wonderful opinion piece in the New York Times, which I've responded to, and I'll talk a little bit about here, why he taught himself to procrastinate. Now, what he's written here is that while procrastination is a vice for productivity, I've learned against my natural inclinations that it's a virtue for creativity. Well, I have a problem with that, and I hope by now you might see why we'd have a problem with that as well. If you read his essay and you continue, he goes on to say, if you're a procrastinator, next time you're wallowing in the dark playground of guilt and self-hatred over failure to start a task, remember, and look what I've put in a bold here, the right kind of procrastination might make you more creative. Now, I hope at this point you can see that what he's trying to do here is avoid other words of delay. In fact, there isn't any kinds of procrastination. There's procrastination and there's other forms of delay. Creativity often involves delay. You might have seen in the chat group, if you arrived earlier, that there's a sagacious delay. Sometimes we need to wait. And when you're writing, for example, writing isn't just with your fingers on the keyboard, and art isn't just with the brush on the canvas, and that goes on and on. But when I've given large public talks, for example, in Toronto, and talked about this, I've had artists and musicians come up to me and say, exactly, Tim, the real writer shows up at 9 a.m. every day. And we know this about it. So the first point I want to make is that procrastination is not a good thing, and delay can feed our creativity, but not procrastination. At that point, we're trying to justify something. The next misconception that I'd like to take on is that, if you want to read my full reply to Adam Grant and get this whole argument, you can go to my blog on Psychology Today, and I'll give you a link to that later. The next one I'd like to take on is that procrastination is a time management problem. Excuse me, I need to wet my whistle just a little bit here. Now, this is a wonderful slide for me. It's so evocative. Many of us feel this every day. We feel the stress and the busyness of our lives, and we feel that we need to have a schedule and that it's all about time management. Of course, if we're trying to manage time, we have all sorts of tools for that. We can make a to-do list. We can have an agenda or a calendar. And in today's world, there's an app for that, right? And there are so many good apps, and I get people all the time working with me on trying to make a better time management app or a better procrastination app, anti-procrastination app. The thing is, you can have your whole schedule ready for tomorrow, and it says at 8 a.m. you're going to finally work on that report. Or maybe it's today at 11 a.m. you're going to finish your taxes. And 11 a.m. comes, and this is what happens in your body. I don't want to. I don't feel like it. I'll feel more like it tomorrow. You see, in that, the procrastinator song, the lyrics of the procrastinator song, I would say, we get a hint of what procrastination really is. Procrastination isn't that the clock is broken somehow. We've done studies to show that procrastinators estimate time just as well as non-procrastinators. In fact, it's not a time management problem. Time management is necessary, but not sufficient. Of course, you need to know how to manage time, but most of us are actually pretty good at that. I can say that you need to use tools better. And if I showed you my calendar, you might flip out at how organized my calendar is. Time management is necessary, but not sufficient, as is prospective memory. You have to remember what you're going to do. And that's why things like ADHD can be related to more unnecessary delay, because we simply forget. So these are necessary, but not sufficient. Now, if that's the case, then how do we make sense of procrastination psychologically? Now, let me slow down for just a second. This is one of the key points I'm going to make today. When you leave this talk, of all the things that you could say about the talk today, what did Professor Pychyl have to say? Well, he said procrastination wasn't a time management thing. In fact, what he said is that it's a self-regulation failure. It's an emotion regulation thing. That procrastination is us giving in to feel good. You know, when you face a task that causes emotions in you like boredom, frustration, resentment, anxiety, you pick your favorite one. There are many others. We've learned very early in life that we can avoid that emotion if we avoid the task. In fact, most of us learn this in school, but we learn it everywhere. And that becomes powerfully reinforcing. So what is procrastination? Well, it's that short-term gain. Present self makes the decision to avoid the task, but of course it's got a certain irrationality to it because the task isn't going away, and poor future self is going to face the same task with no more motivation really, but a lot more time pressure. So procrastination is not a time regulation problem, it's an emotion regulation problem. And in fact, colleagues from Germany, we have at least one participant from Munich today, these colleagues here looked at some of our earlier research in the 1990s and said, oh, look, Pychyl and Blunt have shown that procrastinators are different somehow in terms of their personality. I wonder if we can see a neural signature in the brain. And you see this diagram here provided by the BBC to discuss their research. They have labeled two parts of the brain. The amygdala, which is part of the limbic system, which is our reptilian brain. It's the oldest part of the brain, evolutionarily speaking. And you might think of that collection of cells known as the amygdala as the fight or flight organ. It's the part of our brain that lays down emotions on top of memories and things. And then there's the prefrontal cortex. this part of the brain, which is evolutionarily speaking, the newest part of the brain, and the last part of our brain to mature. It doesn't actually mature until we're about 25. Well, in any case, what these researchers showed with functional magnetic resonance imaging is that the amygdala of chronic procrastinators, the volume's actually larger. And what this in effect means is we get an amygdala hijack. When we get upset, when we have those negative emotions associated with a task, like taxes freak me out. I'm always worried I'm going to owe money. I don't know how to do them. Then it overrides our ability to think and plan. So the next strategy really is to focus on emotions. Now, if I had hours with you, I would focus on how do you do that? But here's the crash course. We have to recognize procrastination for what it is, an avoidant coping response meant to give us short-term mood repair. And then we can think of other coping strategies. What would they be? Well, this is one of my own personal mantras. I can have my feelings, but I don't have to be these feelings. Of course, I can have anxiety. Many people ask me today, are you ready for your talk? Are you nervous about your talk? I think, no, this is what I do every day. Like, I'm excited about my talk. And I can have these emotions, but I can also operate from other parts of my inner landscape. So for sure, I could be worried that my technology might not work, or I won't be able to say everything I want to say. But instead, I can focus on my curiosity, my excitement in joining you. I can have feelings without being feelings. Well, how do I do that? Well, first I have to recognize my feelings, and then I have to take a very mindful approach to my body and calm myself down. Breathing, yogic breathing is very important here. The Marines or the Navy SEALs call it box breathing. I can identify what these feelings have to teach me. Oh, I'm a little worried about my performance today. Why? Because it matters to me, because this is my passion, and because I'm joining a really important community to me. So I recognize that, yeah, it's normal to feel this way. And then I focus on action. What's the next action? And then I say, okay, these are the things I need to do the best job I can. This is so crucial, and I'm going to come back to that shortly. Now, one of the things that Marwan and Maxine asked me to talk about is this one, the misconception of I work better under pressure. And here's a wonderful comic that captures this so well. I'm a parent of 2 teens, and so this feels like a conversation I have a lot. Do you have your homework finished, Jeremy? No, not yet. I'm waiting for the mood to strike me, which puzzles Mom. And she said, adrenaline-fueled panic is not a mood. Are you sure? I never get anything done without it. And of course, many of us feel that way. But instead of saying I work better under pressure, the truth of the matter is I only work under pressure. And in fact, this becomes a well-ingrained habit. I would tell you that I think school is where so much of this starts. School is such an unnatural act, which is an odd thing for a university professor to say, but I never thought I'd ever be a university professor. I was a tennis pro for a long time and Mr. Canoe head. And so now to embrace education like I have really surprises me, because learning in school teaches so many of these habits. We put off our schoolwork, we work at the last minute, and we think this is the only way we can do it. But if I think of habits, I think of Charles Duhigg from the New York Times in this wonderful book he's written on the power of habit. I've had the privilege of talking with Charles often, and he has said most succinctly what I think captures our working under pressure, and that is, we push against the deadline to build tension. The release of tension is a powerful reward, and it is. If I went outside right now in Ottawa here, it's raining, I wouldn't like the cold rain on my head, so I'd put up an umbrella.
What's up, baby?
That's known as negative reinforcement. In other words, I'm getting rid of a negative stimulus. Now, the same thing happens when I push against the deadline. When it gets released, it's so rewarding. And that's a very reinforcing thing. And then we wonder why we keep doing it over and over. But just for fun, when I think of deadlines, I can't help but mention one of my favorite authors, Douglas Adams, who writes, I love deadlines. I love the whooshing sound they make as they fly by. And of course, you're going to see at the end that it's only human to feel both of these things. Life is paradoxical. I'm not asking you to be a machine, and we don't have to be. So I had a student who worked with me on this. We were searching for the arousal procrastinator. If people work better under pressure, let's find them. So we looked at extroverts and we looked at sensation seekers, people who would do what is depicted in our comic strip here of jumping out of airplanes, even people who can tolerate more pain. And lo and behold, we didn't see any correlations between these kinds of personalities and procrastination. But we do see that people use that as an excuse afterwards to reduce the dissonance they feel. So it's more an after the fact explanation than it is a reason that we procrastinate. And in fact, research shows under pressure, we make more errors of omission and commission. We don't actually work better under pressure. And if you're a writer, for example, and you produce a first draft at the last minute, you know it's not your best work, because good writing requires revision. And that's true of most creative processes. So what's the strategy here? Well, it's a simple one in some ways. Let's just get started. Now, I've been doing this research for 25 years in quite a public domain. I have a podcast and things like that. And I've had people say to me, Dr. Pychyl, if I could just get started, I wouldn't have a procrastination problem. Can't you do a little bit better than that? And to do better than that, I actually had to go to the productivity literature. And you might know David Allen. And he's written this beautiful, succinct statement is, what's the next action? And this is another personal mantra of mine. You know, I didn't write in the chat group today what I'm procrastinating on, because quite frankly, I don't. And the reason I don't is I use this strategy constantly. What's the next action? I keep that action small, and I base it on the context I'm in, the time that I have in front of me, the energy that I feel, and my priorities. But I make that action as small as possible. And I say to myself, who couldn't do that? And I get it done. In fact, David Allen has two other rules that I find very helpful, and I'm going to share with you because many people do. The 2-minute rule is, if something's going to take 2 minutes, then do it right now. Don't write it down on the list. Like if I walk into my kitchen, which I can see from here, and I see a few dishes sitting on the counter, I just wash them because it takes just minutes. Now, the 5-minute rule is a bit different. If I get to the point in my day where I think, I got nothing left, I can't do it, I say, well, I'll just try for 5 minutes, because typically what we find is that it's the resistance that we need to overcome. And once we get started, we're fine. And you can see how David Allen got to an answer to the question I found in my own research was, it's getting started that's everything. Now, Mark Twain has been known to say this: if it's your job to eat a frog, it's best to do it first thing in the morning. And if it's your job to eat 2 frogs, it's best to eat the biggest one first. Now, this might become a personal mantra for you. I know when I've worked with judges before, I had in front of each judge a small rubber frog, very colorful one, and I'm sure they thought they were working with a kindergarten teacher at that point. But then I explained all I'm talking to you about, and I explained this quote. And I had judges write to me by email later and say, Tim, that frog sits on my desk, and I ask myself each day, what's my frog today? What's the thing I need to get done? Because the day's so much easier after that. This is a personal mantra for some people. The other big thing here is that, and it's shown in this research that I've referenced here, is that when we think about things concretely, our brain sees them as being urgent and belonging to today. But when we think about things abstractly, oh, mañana, they belong to tomorrow. So it's really important that you think of your tasks concretely. It will just nudge you in the right direction. If you think about things abstractly, they, as we talked about in the Latin roots of procrastination, belong to tomorrow. Now, the last really important topic I want to deal with is this notion that perfectionists are procrastinators. And I want to talk a little bit about this because so many of us who are pursuing our passions, deeply involved in the act of creativity, are also wrapped up in perfection. But the key thing is, if you want to know about perfectionism, I invite you to learn about the work of Gord Flett. He's a friend of mine at York University, an exceptional researcher, been a Canada Research Chair for years. He's a world expert on perfectionism. So I'm going to draw on his work amongst others. We've published together on this. He would say, you know, there's a few flavors of perfectionism. I'm just going to focus on 2 right now. There's a self-oriented perfectionist, someone who's just striving to do the best job they can. And that's the only thing that's going on. And then there's a socially prescribed perfectionist. These are people who have internalized the expectations of others, typically unrealistic. And that inner dialogue is very destructive. Now, when we look at research, and these are the only numbers I'm going to show you this morning, if we measure procrastination and we measure these two flavors of perfectionism, lo and behold, the self-oriented, the striving perfectionism isn't correlated with procrastination, but socially prescribed perfectionism is. Why? Because we have perfectionistic concerns, unrealistic expectations of others, and we ruminate, and this is destructive. Now, I showed you Brene Brown's book at the outset, and if you notice the title of it, it's The Gifts of Imperfection. In fact, when I presented this to some judges in Edmonton in the fall of 2019, one of the judges came up and said, have you read this book on the spirituality of imperfection? You see, it's deeply human for us to strive to be perfect and to internalize these things. And who knew this better than one of our favorite Canadian poets and songwriters, Leonard Cohen? Now, I think you're way ahead of me now because I know what group I'm speaking to. And you know the lyrics of the song I'm going to show you, but these two are a personal mantra. Ring the bell that still can ring. Forget your perfect offering. There's a crack in everything. That's how the light gets in. So where we go with this, of course, is that we have to challenge that negative self-talk. And it's alive and well in each one of us. It's our common humanity. Human beings are predictably irrational and unnecessarily harsh on ourselves, and we need to practice self-compassion. I never learned this any more than one of my colleagues, Michael Wall, prolific researcher at Carleton University, and he has done research on forgiveness, said, Tim, we should do some research on self-forgiveness and procrastination. I said, we can, Michael, but I think it'll be forgive and forget. I should have never doubted Michael. He is much smarter than I am, and he proved me wrong. In fact, we found that people who procrastinated and did poorly and then forgave themselves procrastinated less in the future. I said, Michael, how does that work? And he said, Tim, imagine there'd been a transgression between us. How would you feel about that? What would be the motivation? I said, well, I'd avoid you, Michael, and I expect you to avoid me. He said, yeah. Now, what if I forgave you or if you forgave me? Well, the motivation would be approached. He said, exactly. But with procrastination, the transgression is against the self. And unless we forgive ourselves, as it says here, we can't get well and move on. So this self-compassion can be rooted in self-forgiveness. We are only human. Now, I expected we'd get here and have very little time, but I do have just a couple minutes before we take questions. So I'll tell you that, most of us think that the problem with procrastination is performance. But that's not the case. Although on the whole, people do more poorly when they procrastinate, and it's usually harmful, it's not the worst effect of procrastination. In fact, the reason I started studying procrastination is I learned that it predicted our well-being. The things we said we're going to do and never do are the things that make us really feel awful about ourselves. Our life satisfaction is poor, and we feel poor emotionally. And in fact, one of my past students and now a prolific researcher at Sheffield University, or University of Sheffield in the UK, has shown us that it affects our health. For goodness sake, she's shown us that coronary heart disease and hypertension are related to procrastination. The stress, the treatment delay, and the fewer wellness behaviors contribute to our poor health. It affects our relationships. When I don't do the things I said I was going to do today, I cancel my dates with friends and family, and I undermine their faith and trust in me. And of course, on the whole, what it is, it's a deeply existential issue because it's not getting on with life itself. And the regrets that clinicians will tell us are the things I said I would have done in my life and I didn't. So in sum, I've presented quite a few strategies for change here, and I'll take questions in just a minute now. We really need to recognize procrastination for what it is. It's an emotion-focused coping strategy. It's not your terrible time management. But you can't expect to feel motivated. Most of the time, there are tasks we're facing, like our taxes, where we're not motivated, but we still have to do it. You have to have a non-judgmental awareness of these emotions, but challenge that negative self-talk. I didn't get into this, but you also have to set up your environment so that it doesn't get in the way, which usually means put your phone somewhere else. We have to think about the future because future self isn't going to like us. Really, I want you to focus about that next action. Once I've become aware that I've got negative emotions and I've said, yep, I've got them, but it's okay. I can act despite that. What is the next action? I might choose the most difficult one to start my day. I'll make it as concrete as possible. And at the heart of it all, I'm going to make sure that I accept this common humanity. Now, if you'd like to know more, you can see my work at procrastination.ca. Way back in 2006, I began a podcast. I have to warn you that the audio was very bad because I started this long before we knew very much about effective microphones and things, but the content is excellent. But I want to end with a simple slide. And this is for the people who were in my breakout group in particular. I'm thinking of one woman in particular because it's a deeply existential thing. This is a quote taken from Francis Bacon, the philosopher. And it really captures what interests me most in procrastination. And I leave this with you as a thought for today. Begin doing what you want to do now. We are not living in eternity. We have only this moment, sparkling like a star in our hand and melting like a snowflake. Carpe diem, and thank you for your attention.
If the tasks that you have to do cannot be broken down into small actionable tasks easily, are there any other ways to get through the barrier? Oh, it's skipping away. Get through the barriers of procrastination.
Well, it's every, we don't do whole projects or tasks. We actually do actions and behaviors. So I'm not actually advocating that we break the task down. In fact, sometimes people do that. They make plans, they say, I need to do this, I need to do that, and I need to do this. And then they say, and I'll do it tomorrow because they think that that planning was enough work for today. What I'm saying instead is that keep that action to, let's say I'm trying to write a letter of reference, which I find rather challenging, to be honest with you, because they're high stakes for the person I'm writing for. I need to be very precise and I need to draw on real life examples. So I find it aversive. And so my next action might be, I need to open my laptop and read the email from that student just to see what he or she needs. That's what I'm doing. See, I haven't even started writing a letter. And I can't break down a letter into smaller tasks necessarily either. I'm not advocating that. I'm advocating find that first action that you would take to get you started. And then typically what happens is that, and I might have to do that a few times, and I'll tell you in my day, and this is maybe a little embarrassing, but there are days when I'm having bad days emotionally, and I might have to do what's the next action, maybe 50 times, right? I bootstrap my whole day that way. But you know what? I get to the end of the day and I go, wow, I did it. I didn't feel like it. In fact, I felt like crap all day, but I got my stuff done. So it's not breaking it down. It's finding what's the next action and just doing that action. Because psychologists have shown us that even a small bit of progress on a goal feeds our well-being. It's one of the few upward spirals in psychology we know of, because we know that downward spiral of procrastination all too well. Thanks for the question.
Yeah, I love that, Tim. Thank you. That's a good tip. I have a question here from Kelly. She'd love to hear more about self-forgiveness. I think that's a great one, actually. So she's asking, how do you do that? And what are some good examples?
I'd have you go to the work of Brene Brown, and I'd have you go to the work of people who practice, some of you are filling in the gap already, I hope, about not just Zen, but particularly loving kindness. There's whole literatures on these things. It's self-forgiveness comes from a place of actually seeing yourself like the other. Many of us are more kind to other people than we are to ourselves to start with. But self-forgiveness has at its root, I would say, even if you don't go to some of these other traditions or go and read Brene Brown, the fact that we're only human and embracing our own common humanity is a foundation for self-forgiveness. And that can be even something like, of course I feel anxious, or of course I don't want to do my taxes. No one does. And that opens up that willingness to recognize that you're just like everybody else. And would you treat other people as harshly as you're treating yourself? That's a place to start. But boy, you've asked a difficult question. But there are literatures out there, and those two books that I recommended would be a great place if this is something you want to work on.
I love that reminder. Yeah, the little voice inside your head, would you talk to anybody else that way? That's strong. Yeah. I have to read these comments. They're really sweet. So someone says, Carpe Diem was a personal mantra as a teen, but somewhere along the way, they forgot about it. So thank you for the important reminder. And Anna says, Dr. Pychyl is hands down the best psych prof I ever had. So happy to see him here today.
That's sweet. I want to give a shout out to one of my colleagues, Dean. I see Dean Verger here. So, hey, Dean.
Yeah, lots of wonderful feedback. It's great. Somebody's looking forward to eating that amphibian.
Yes, that's right. Now my son jokes that, you know, people don't eat frogs like that, Dad. And when they do, apparently they just eat their legs and they taste like chicken. And I said, oh, Alex, don't ruin my metaphor. But we all know what it means, and we know what Mark Twain was getting at. And in fact, I want to tell you that Viktor Frankl, the Viennese psychiatrist who lost almost everything near and dear to him in the Nazi concentration camps, even he came to the same conclusion as autobiography, that I learned to do the most difficult tasks first. And it's kind of profound that a man who's spent time in a Nazi concentration camp, that was one of the lessons he learned, is that life is short. Time is the only non-renewable resource we have. We don't know how much we're going to get of it. Let's use it wisely.
I love that. I have another really great question here. Somebody's asking, what is the link between procrastination and ADHD? Big one.
Well, we have done one study on it. There aren't many, but it has a lot to do with prospective memory. It has a lot to do with not being able to maintain our attention focus. And in some ways, I would argue, and this is still an active debate, is that I wouldn't say that someone who has ADHD is necessarily a procrastinator per se. The self-regulation is breaking down, yes, but the cause is the problems with attention. And if you can treat those things, you might get rid of what you're calling procrastination, because it's not necessarily because you're looking with dread at the task and you're doing what I talked about in terms of emotion regulation. It's just that you can't keep things organized. And I'm coaching a fellow in the UK who's about to start Concerta because he's been diagnosed with late onset ADHD. And it's really freeing to recognize that, yeah, this is something I need to deal with. It's propedeutic to healing. And now it doesn't mean because we're all human, this person won't procrastinate, but it may take up a lot of the problem with self-regulation. So ADHD certainly related to procrastination, but I'm telling you that the waters are muddy because not all delay is procrastination.
Wonderful. Okay, two other questions I can see here. Just a reminder, if anybody would want to ask a question themselves, please use the raise hand feature. We'll unmute you. So Rachel is asking, how do we attack procrastination when our lives feel delayed due to COVID? So I think you'll probably say, just find that first actionable task. But maybe you could speak a little bit to lighting that fire that we sometimes need to get out of that crummy state of mind, I suppose.
It's funny, just the other day on the radio, I heard someone talk about how to make plans. And they argued that you should either be making plans for a year from now or right now. Don't make plans in the near future because we keep getting disappointed. I thought it was interesting wisdom. But I would talk about always right now. What choice are you going to make for the next 5 minutes? And if you make that choice and you do it, you're already winning. You see, we keep looking back and saying, I didn't do this, I didn't do that. And the question is, yeah, that's true. But you know what? The only reality that has is in your mind, first of all. No one else is even aware of it. Now you're ruminating. And rumination is a really big problem. But again, it's common humanity. And instead, quiet those voices, non-judgmental awareness. Yep, I'm ruminating. It's really common in human beings. And instead say, what am I going to do right now? And if you make that small win, all of a sudden you feel that sense of agency and I can do that again. And you can bootstrap your sense of agency as a person. So we all feel overwhelmed. And there's where kindness comes in too. But we have to watch. Sometimes what we do to cope is we're using substances or we're burying ourselves in our devices, and these are not feeding us. So way too big a question for you to answer in the 30 seconds that I have. But those things speak to that question.
Wonderful. Okay, so we're at time for questions, but I will ask you just one more that came up here. Marwan is asking, how do you stay calm?
Well, I'd start with, most of us overlook this, but I went past it so quickly, but breathing is a good one. And if we had more time together, we could even do it now. Like I do it with my daughter all the time because she's a 16-year-old girl who's had 2 birthdays and full lockdown. Like, she's not a very happy girl. So breathing, deep belly breathing, not your shoulders aren't rising. You're breathing, and breathe in and hold it for 5 seconds. Or breathe in for 5 seconds, hold it gently for 5 seconds, breathe out for 5 seconds. You do that 10 times, your whole body starts to relax. And in fact, you'll see that that's going to give your prefrontal cortex a chance to kick in. And then you can start doing the work of non-judgmental awareness. Muscle relaxation is another technique. As I've gotten older, I've learned to embrace yoga. I was too impatient as a young man. It's not necessarily a virtue, but here I am now, and yoga saves me because I slow myself down. But that's where most of us overlook that. Sometimes we first have to calm down. Thank you for that question, Marwan. Breathing is so essential. In fact, the last little story is I worked with judges, and one of them came up from California. He was a senior judge who was working with us in these workshops, and he talked about listening to a trial where a horrible thing was going on, and he realized that he wasn't breathing anymore. If he couldn't breathe, he couldn't listen, and he couldn't adjudicate. And so he started to learn to breathe. And I think all of us could listen more to him. We need to breathe to live properly.
That was awesome. Thank you so much. It's always so fun to see the amazing talent in the city. It's like remarkable to me. So thank you. My question was, you nodded a little to this idea that schools, I have a 10-year-old, may be creating part of this pattern or dynamic. And I'm curious if you've done any additional thinking about, like, if you were Minister of Education, what would you possibly do to unleash a new pattern, a new way, which of course will have some consequences, I'm sure. But what could we do to have this not be the pattern that we cultivate as a publicly funded education system?
Does anyone have an easy question?
I wondered if you're writing a next book on it, Tim. That was what I was wondering.
Yeah, that would be, you need it. But first of all, when I did teach school, I did my B.Ed. I quit my PhD and did a B.Ed and started teaching school. And I worked in an alternative school because I believe very strongly that in the alternative framework, in terms of students don't need that structure. They need to engage their learning the way learning naturally occurs, and learning is integrative, and it should be project driven. I don't think anybody would know this better than this group, right? You know how you learn what you need to learn to develop the things you want to develop. But that would require enormous amounts of resources and more importance put on education by our community. Like, we always joke it takes a community to raise a child. Well, it would need that. I think that students wouldn't be stuck in a building every day. They would be going out and being part of the community, and they'd be coming back and sharing what they learned. So it would be a huge rift in the fabric of our society to do education right, I would argue. And so it's a pipe dream in that way. Because even when we did alternative schools, we still shoved ourselves in a classroom and worked within that framework. But successful education would require that we change it from the social engineering that emerged with the Industrial Revolution to a real focus on what do our young people need to become fully functioning human beings, and not just people that get some sorts of credentials that we think are important. So you can see how revolutionary I think these changes would be. Now, on a smaller scale, because I know I called out Dean, and there are other of my colleagues that I know that could be watching, that we can make individual choices in our own classrooms to give students autonomy. Autonomy is huge. It's a human condition. It's a basic human need. And if we allow students to have autonomy, if we allow younger people in particular to suffer non-catastrophic failure, in other words, they have to learn to self-regulate. If we don't have huge demands for control, but we allow them to explore within the framework of a course, we're making steps in that direction. So although I have a grand vision for a change in education, I think in every day we can do that. Even as parents, like we did some research in the 90s about parenting style and procrastination. And not surprisingly, it's the authoritarian parenting style that is so bad. And authoritarian parenting means high demands for control and low warmth. In other words, you're making your kids do what you want when you want it. And of course, they don't learn any self-regulation skills. They only learn either to rebel by putting things off and trying to make you crazy, or they don't learn how to structure their time themselves. So there's a lot of ideas out there to start to answer your question.
A question around research and rates of procrastination, and whether we're seeing a whole increase or decrease in society of rates of procrastination.
Wow, these are really good questions. All the most difficult of questions. So there was some early research done by a colleague of mine at the DePaul University in Chicago. And he's fond of saying that 20% of adults are chronic procrastinators. Now, that's plagued with problems in terms of how do you define a cutoff for chronic, and how are you measuring procrastination? But in other words, there are people troubled by the fact that they procrastinate all the time. The notion of whether it's increasing or not, it's how do we measure it? And it's very poorly measured. And I couldn't give you data on how procrastination is increasing, but I'll give you an example. A student of mine in 2000, we published a paper about online procrastination. And this is before students had cell phones, before Web 2.0, and before social media, before all of those things. In fact, the way we did this study is we had to go into computer labs, because that's where most students had access to a computer. All those things said, students reported that 50% of the time they were online, they were procrastinating. Can you imagine what that looks like now with cell phones and social media? So I would argue that technology, much like, I lost one at the moment, a real critic in the late 20th century of social media and the media in general, we're amusing ourselves to death. And so I would argue, yes, we see procrastination increasing. That said, it's not a new phenomenon either. Other languages have a word for it. The ancient Egyptians understood the word, and we saw the Latin roots. We do know that there is such a thing as needless delay, but I'm very worried about the use of technology. Neil Postman is the name I was searching for, in terms of how we are amusing ourselves to death.
Okay, I lost track of that other one again. Oh, well. So I think it was around the idea of the new trendy word that's come out, languish, and whether we find that procrastination is a coping tool to languish, perhaps. I don't know if you have thoughts around that.
I don't. My wife asked me about that. I saw it come up in the New York Times a week ago or so. There's also something about bedtime. There's research on bedtime procrastination, but this was sort of, well, does anyone know the words that were being used around bedtime recently? It had to do with, some people call it procrastination, but in any case, I would argue that some of this is just the emotional response to very stressful times, and we are languishing, but I wouldn't call it procrastination. You can see I define procrastination rather narrowly, and I do it on purpose because it's everything and it means nothing. And I see that in the media all the time. Everyone loves to use it, primarily because we love sound bites, we love attention getting memes. And if I can turn a vice into a virtue, I can get your attention. But then the truth is the casualty there. And so I try to keep the focus on this culpably unwarranted delay, the voluntary delay of an intended action despite expecting to be worse off for the delay, as a narrow definition of procrastination. And I would say that languishing is something different, and it has more probably to do with emotionally related delay. Yeah, but that's more than I can comment on now.
I love that you mentioned sleep quickly. When we were in the breakout room, someone mentioned that that's what they've been procrastinating during the pandemic. So it's, there's something really, I feel like we could have a whole separate conversation about that as well.
Yeah, well, let's do just a little bit on that. There is a research on sleep procrastination, and people do procrastinate on sleep. You know, it's one of these things where we make rational decisions over irrationally short periods of time. We do it everything. I'll just check my email, it'll only take a minute. I'll just update my Twitter feed, it'll only take a minute. And 3 hours later, we're wondering why we're watching a seal hit a kayaker with an octopus. Like, I wasn't looking for that. And it's because every minute we make the same decision and hours go by. And the same can happen with sleep. I'll just watch one more episode of this. And typically we're binge watching old sitcoms or whatever. So there is sleep procrastination going on. And there is the same things that I talked about can break the sleep procrastination habit. But for some people who are busy with their families At the end of the day, it's the only time they can carve for themselves. And that's what's been written about in the literature and the popular media lately, is that people are staying up late because they think, well, this is my time. Of course, then future self hates them because they're up at 2 o'clock till 2 in the morning. They have to get up at 6 o'clock in the morning with their kids. And of course, that's a negative downward spiral for health. Sleep is a fundamental health behavior, undermines your well-being. And when your well-being goes down, your self-regulation skills go down. So sleep is so fundamental. So there's a bunch of other comments to chew on.
Is executive dysfunction tied to procrastination? Any tips to manage that? I don't actually know what that executive dysfunction is. I don't know if you can speak to that a little bit too.
Well, I'm going to interpret it as being executive function. Remember I talked about the prefrontal cortex being that last part of the brain evolutionary to be added. And that prefrontal cortex is often known as the seat of executive function. Now, the brain is more complex than that. It's all connected, right? But we can simplify it and say, yep, the frontal cortex is where we have executive function. That's planfulness, organization, impulse control. So an executive dysfunction is that you have problems with impulse control. You have problems organizing yourself. And so, yes, very much related to procrastination because it's a problem with self-regulation failure if I'm not able to direct my attention where I want. And in that regard, you know, it's interesting. I had a comment from one of my past colleagues who was a counselor who's on here today. And she said, oh, so it's all about the amygdala. And I thought to myself, you know, typically when I talk about the amygdala, I also say, now don't go saying to your friends or your parents or your spouse that, well, it's not my fault I'm a procrastinator, my amygdala is too large. Because I can show you research out of the University of Pittsburgh where even 8 weeks of mindfulness meditation actually shrinks the size of the amygdala and changes the connections of the prefrontal cortex. So what we call executive dysfunction, to go back to that question specifically, can be part of or manifested by that amygdala hijack. And if you were to practice mindfulness and develop the ability of gaining more attentional control, you will bootstrap your executive function as well. It's known as neuroplasticity, and biology is not destiny. So again, these are all comments you can think about in relation to that question.
Somebody is asking around whether you have tips, Tim, on how we can set up our environment for action.
Good for you. Yes, there's we had to, I showed Maxine and Marwan a huge deck of slides and they had to help me ruthlessly cut them back. And there was a section called extended will. If I said to my buddy Dean there, Dean, what's 3 times 3? He'd quickly say 9. And if I said, what's 867 times 1,364? No, I know Dean's kind of smart, but I don't think he'd do that so quickly in his head. And he'd say, I can't do that in my head. I said, of course not. But if I gave you a piece of paper and a pencil, you could. He'd say, absolutely. We call that extended cognition. We're able to extend our thinking by using tools. So the same thing happens with the environment for willpower. We should be able to extend our will. We need willpower prosthetics. So we have to set ourselves up for success. And we tell our children this all the time. We say that your area where you do your schoolwork should just be your desk and it only should have your school materials there. Don't have every distraction under the sun. And for those people who love to hit the snooze button, better self, because we all have better self at certain parts of the day, better self takes that alarm clock, puts it on the other side of the room, turns the volume up really loud, and now you have to get out of bed to shut that off. And if you're really bad at that, you put another one out in the hallway, right? These are also called pre-commitment devices. So we start to set the environment up to favor us that way. I want to go for a run in the morning. Oh, I get up in the morning. Where's my stuff? No. You put your running gear at the side of your bed so that when your feet hit the floor, you're standing on the stuff and you put it on. And then you bootstrap that with what's the next action? Oh, I don't feel like going for a run. Of course you don't. That's the procrastinator song. Just step outside the door, please. What's the next action? Just go outside, right? And the crazy thing about human beings is imagine I'm trying to ride my exercise bike. Oh, I can't do it. I just don't want to do it. Just sit on the bike and move your feet. 10 minutes later, I'm sure I could ride the Tour de France. That's how predictably irrational we all are, right? I go from not being able to do it to quite sure I could ride the Tour de France. So you have to recognize that's our common humanity. So setting up the environment means those sorts of things. But there's also the social environment. Imagine that I want to exercise every day. And this is kind of like the accountability that Maxine was talking about. But I can easily say at the end of the day, oh, I'm too tired now. I knew I said I was going to go for a run, but look, it's kind of drizzly outside and I'm tired. Oh no, I told Maxine I'm going to meet her at 4 and I never let a friend down. That's something I know about myself. So I leverage my self-control. I know I'd never let a friend down. I make the commitment. Now, other ways that people use pre-commitment devices like that, and there's even apps that do this now, is that if you make this commitment and you don't follow through on it, you're making a charitable donation to the Trump campaign. And I use that here just because most of us would be deeply offended by such a notion, right? But you pick your favorite. Maybe you like Trump and it would be a donation to the Liberal Party. I don't know what your leanings are, but you get the gist of it, right? That you do something that you'd say, I'm not doing that. I'm going to avoid that. So you're trying to set up things, and it's perversely your own. Like, I know friends who can deny themselves a Friday night meal if they don't exercise during the week. Well, not everybody, doesn't work for everybody. But if it works for you, for goodness sake, set it up. When good self is there, set up these pre-commitment devices, get the house organized. Now, I would tell you that little stuff matters too. And so would the Marines. Make your bed in the morning as soon as you get out of bed. Why? Because, hey, you're already off to a good start. I try to teach my children that. And just one quick story. My son, when he was about 6, maybe 7, I said, Alex, it's time for you to start learning to make your bed. Of course, he said, I don't want to. I don't feel like it. So I pulled out every stop as a psychologist and the teacher. And I said, hey, Alex, how'd you like to earn $1? He said, you'll pay me $1 to make my bed? I said, no, I'll give you $1 if you can count to 10 before I can make your bed. But you have to count 1001, 1002. He said, okay. Now my son has a single bed with a sheet, a duvet, and a pillow, right? And how long does it take to make the bed? Even going slowly, it took me 6 seconds. So he got to 6 and I said, I'm done. He says, I don't get my $1, do I? I said, no, but you can see it takes 6 seconds to make your bed. Let's make your bed in the morning, right? Now, that doesn't mean he has ever since then. He did for a while because life is more complex than that. But for you and I, we have a 6-year-old running around in our head. And we can look at tasks like they're insurmountable, and they truly are 6 seconds tasks. And when we start doing them, all of a sudden we have a sense of agency and other stuff gets done. So all that goes into my answer.
And I absolutely love that. I think I'm going to try that with my partner, which probably won't be good for my relationship.
No, you never want to try to fix the other. That's for sure.
I love that so much. That's a great tip. And I would also recommend atomic habits for setting up your environment properly. I like what I personally do too is like I try to keep my phone in another room while I'm at my desk at work, because then I'm not quickly distracted by grabbing it. So yeah, lots of good tips in that one as well.
You mentioned so many different areas of studies when it comes to procrastination, which really opened up my eyes to the world of procrastination. But these days, what are you interested in within that world? Or do you have any research going, or what's really got you excited in the world of procrastination?
Well, thank you, Marwan. I'm doing lots of research. I just reviewed a paper, if our German colleagues are still here, a paper from Germany on Wednesday. And it's about emotions. Too much emphasis is put on the research on our thinking. For example, we know that we discount future rewards. Yeah, it's true about human beings, but why do we discount them? I would argue it's an emotional thing. We have a very quick emotional response to the world. It's evolutionarily adaptive, fight or flight, right? And that part of our brain is active. And I think we have to focus more on that. So what I'm passionate about, Marwan, is emotion regulation. How do we help people regulate their own emotions? Because we don't do enough of that with our young people, and it's to our demise. And some of us are wired very tightly like that, and we react emotionally first, and then we're behind the 8 ball. So that's where a lot of my emphasis is on. Also trying to demonstrate that it isn't just about the value of a task, that we end up doing things we value more. I'll say no. In fact, oftentimes we recognize that I'm not doing what I should be doing. The Greeks had this notion of akrasia, and that I think it's because, again, we're not able to mindfully engage in life. And if I can end with anything, it's that I rushed near the end to talk about the deeply existential issue of procrastination. But it is, the only non-renewable resource in our lives is time. And I said this to Jasmine when we were talking in our breakout group, and we don't know how much we're even going to get of that. In fact, I've been sipping on water a fair bit because a year ago, I wasn't even sure I was going to be here because I got oral pharyngeal cancer and had radiation treatment to my head and neck. And so now my saliva glands are gone and there's lots of things I have to deal with. But here I am, and I'm thrilled. A journalist recently asked me, has it changed your perspective on life? And I said, no, I've always had a deeply existential attitude towards life, but it became painfully evident that I might be closer to the end than I thought. Many of you are much younger than I am, and some of you aren't. But just know that life is precious. Your time is precious. This is your life. Carpe diem, right? Really seize the day, seize this moment, right? And find joy in those things, and celebrate your successes, and let go of those shortcomings. They're only alive in your head, and rumination is truly an enemy. So procrastination interests me because it's a deeply existential issue. It's not for the tweaking of this and that so I can become more productive in the mundane sense. It's so that I can live the life that I want to live. And if you do that every day, you've found the secret of life. Last comment. When I say that, I'm reminded of an old Zen story. A young monk who's seeking enlightenment goes to the master saying, I've been sitting, I've been praying. What do I need to achieve enlightenment? And the master says, have you eaten your rice? He said, yes. Then wash your bowl. And in that story is everything I wanted to say today, right? Wash your bowl. That's the next action. And that's typically what we need to do in life. And if you can grasp that, then you're enlightened, right? And to me, that's deeply, powerfully important. I hope in something I said today, you'll find your own personal mantra on your own journey right now, because that's where we're all at. And it's been a pleasure joining you today. Thanks again for the invitation and for the deep perspective, just sticking around to talk.